ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another live stream. Another chapter in the book of Spice and Wolf. A third book, to be specific. Yes, hello. Hola. Buenos dias. Good morning. Ohayo gozaimasu. Guten Morgen. Goedemorgen. That's about all the languages I know. How are y'all faring on this lovely Monday evening? The weather is quite nice outside, at least where I am. Not a cloud in sight, actually. And it's hot like hell. Open the window real quick. There we go. Let some wind in. So. Tonight, I think, is the last chapter in this book. Now, I don't know if I will continue reading it. It depends. I have to buy another one, but they're fairly cheap, so that's not the problem. It's just, maybe I want to switch up what I'm doing a bit. But who knows? We'll see. Anyway, it's past 8 almost, so I think I'll start talking, or start reading. But let me first do this. There we go, that's better. Right. Water is sipped, voice is warmed up, and there we go. Lawrence sneezed grandly. Of course, he didn't make a difference when he traveled alone, but lately it had a certain cheeky, irritable companion, so Lawrence always minded himself. Now, though, it seemed he was slipping, hence the sneeze. He frantically checked to see if the other occupant of the blanket was still asleep, only to realize that side was rather cold. And then he remembered that he was alone, sleeping on the wheat sacks next to Mark's stall. He tried to prepare himself for it and had after all chosen to sleep alone. But upon awakening, he felt a huge sense of loss. Lawrence was used to someone being beside him when he awoke. He had become so quickly accustomed to it that only now did he realize its value. Lawrence overcame his reluctance to part from his warm blanket and stood up suddenly. Frigid air immediately attacked him. The morning sky was still dim, but already Mark's apprentice was sweeping the area in front of the stall. Good morning, sir. Good morning. It didn't seem like this was a show to put on for the benefit of his master's acquaintance. Undoubtedly, it was the boy's habit to wake this early in order to prepare the stall for opening. He casually greeted a few other boys that passed by. He was an admirable apprentice. More than whatever training Mark had given him, the boy simply seemed like an excellent individual. That reminds me. The boy turned around smartly as soon as Lawrence spoke. That reminds me. Did you hear from Mark what's happening today? No. Are we not forcing that dastardly villain into a trap? asked the apprentice. The boy lowered his voice and spoke in such an exaggerated, serious fashion that Lawrence was stunned for a moment. With a serious fashion... Oh, with a true merchant's discipline, he managed to keep a straight face and nodded. I can't tell you the details, but that's it, more or less. I may have to ask a serious favor of you in the process. Oh, sorry. There we go. The boy held his broom at his side like a sword and gulped. Seeing the boy made Lawrence sure of one thing. He might well have been the promising young apprentice of a wheat seller, but his heart still longed for a life of a knight. After all, one only sees dastardly villains in fairy tales. Lawrence got a ticklish feeling, as though he was looking back on his younger self. What's your name, lad? Ah, it's... When a merchant asked another person for their name, it was an acknowledgement of that person's status. The boy had probably never been asked his name before in his life. Despite his visible fluster, he really was an admirable lad, Lawrence felt. The boy straightened up and answered, Land. My name is Eoland. Born from the Northlands, in the Northlands, were you? Yes, from a village frozen in snow and frost. Lawrence saw that Land's description was not an easy way to convey a sense of his hometown, but a literal description of how it must have seemed when he looked back on it for the last time. That was how things were in the Northland. I see. Well, I'm counting on you today, Land. Lawrence extended his right hand, and Land hurried to wipe his own hand off his tunic before shaking Lawrence's proffered hand. The boy's palm was rough and calloused, and who knew what sort of future it might grasp. Lawrence knew he had to win. He let the boy's hand go. Well then, first, let's fill our bellies, eh? Is there any place nearby that's selling food yet? There is a stand that sells dried bread to travelers. Shall I go and buy some? Indeed, said Lawrence, and produced 2 tarnished iret pieces that were so dark they looked almost coppery. One should be plenty. The other one's an advance for your help today. Of course, I'll pay you proper consideration when it's all done. The boy was stunned. Smiling, Lawrence added, If you dawdle, Mark's liable to arrive. No doubt he'll claim breakfast as a luxury, don't you think? Land nodded hastily and dashed off. Lawrence watched his form recede for a while and then turned to gaze into the spaces between the many stalls across the street. Don't you spoil my apprentice now. You could have stopped me. Mark's form appeared in the spaces between the crates. His expression seemed irritable and he sighed. It's gotten cold lately. If he takes ill because I haven't let him eat enough, that's more trouble for me. It was clear now that Mark had a good deal of affection for Lund. But having Lund get some breakfast was no simple act of kindness. It was also an important part of Lawrence's plan. Merchants were not saints, after all. Whatever their actions, they always have ulterior motives. Should be good weather today. Good for selling. He finished with a nod. Lawrence took a deep breath. The bracing morning air felt good. When he exhaled all the unnecessary thoughts from his mind, in his mind seemed to leave with his breath. Oh, shit, one moment. Excusez-moi. I had to grab something real quick. All he had to think about was making his plan succeed. Once success was his, he could second guess and doubt all he wanted. Right then, time to fill my stomach, said Lawrence heartily, as he caught sight of the winded land returning. The atmosphere itself was different. That was the first thing that struck Lawrence as he arrived at the marketplace. What at first look seemed to be as quiet as a glassy lake surface was a roiling boil as soon as one touched it. Ever since sunrise, a single corner of the marketplace was focus of an unusually dense crowd, and every person's gaze was turned to a single stall. It was the sole stone seller in the town of Cumberson, and the only detail the crowd cared about was a makeshift board with the prices written on it. On the price board were written descriptions of the weight and shape of pieces of pyrite. Besides each description was a wooden placard with the price and number of people in line to buy it. There was another column on the board that listed sellers, but it seemed unlikely that there would be a chance for these placards to stay there for long. The board made obvious the supply and demand for pyrite, and the demand was high. Looks like the average price is 800 iret. That was 80 times the old price. It could be only described as absurd. Like a runaway horse with no rider to check it. The price kept rising and rising. Presented with an opportunity for easy money, human reason was like grains of mud, completely incapable of stopping this runaway horse. Though the market bell would not ring for some time, there seemed to be a tacit approval for doing early deals. Once Lawrence reached the stand, he caught sight of merchants approaching the master occasionally and to whisper a few words. Once a number of deals had been reached, the master would quietly replace the relevant wooden placards. The master didn't update the prices and line numbers immediately, probably to keep others from knowing exactly who had purchased pyrite at what price. But in any case, the number of people waiting to buy kept rising. Just as Lawrence was estimating the amount being spent, a figure appeared at the edge of his vision. He looked. It was Amati. Lawrence had seen Amati before Amati had spotted him the previous night, but the young merchant was sharp-eyed enough not to let chances for profit escape. His gaze was every bit as keen as Lawrence's, and he soon caught sight of his rifle. A friendly greeting would hardly have been appropriate, but since Lawrence had arranged to collect the cash he was owed, upon the sounding of the bell that opened the marketplace, he could hardly ignore Amati either. Just as he considered this, Amati revealed a smile and nodded slightly. Lawrence was taken aback for a moment, but soon understood the reason. Beside Amati was Holo. For whatever reason, she was not dressed as a town girl, but instead wore her nun's robes. 3 pure white feathers, vivid enough to be visible at a distance, were affixed to her hood. She looked steadily at the stone seller's stall, not once meeting Lawrence's eye. Heat rose in his belly at Amati's smile. Holo whispered something in Amati's ear before the young merchant made his way through the gathered merchants toward Lawrence. And Lawrence feigned total serenity, as if the anger he felt did not exist. He had confidence that, as long as he did not have to fool Holo, his charade would go unchallenged. "Good morning, Mr. Lawrence." "And to you." It took some effort for Lawrence to maintain his the facade in his face for Amati's, in the face of Amati's pleasant greeting. "Things are going to become quite hectic once the bell rings, so I thought it would be best to turn this over to you ahead of time," said Amati, producing a small bag from near his breast. In size, it was more of a coin purse than anything else. "What's this?" Lawrence asked, having expected Amati to give him the agreed-upon silver coins. The bag was far too small to carry 300 pieces of silver. "This is the promised amount." Having no choice, Lawrence suspiciously accepted the bag, then opened the bag and the bag's mouth and looked inside. His eyes widened. "It might have been a bit presumptuous of me, but 300 silver pieces would be quite cumbersome, so I took the liberty of remitting in gold limar coins." Though it was hard to imagine how he'd managed to obtain them, the bag was indeed filled with gold coins. The gold limar was not as valuable as Lumione, but it was a wildly circulated coin, within Ploania, the country in which Cumberson was so situated. It was worth about 20 trenni, but managing to obtain this amount during a currency shortage, the service charge must have been incredibly steep. The only reason to do it was for Amati to prove how much coin he had on hand. It was a psychological attack. Amati had Holo in tow too, probably as another way to divert Lawrence's attention. Lawrence had inadvertently widened his eyes in surprise, so there was no concealing his perturbation. "I've used today's exchange rate to prepare the amount. 14 gold limar." "Understood. I accept." "Do you not wish to count the coins?" Normally saying "there's no need," as Lawrence did, should have shown confidence, but now it just seemed as though he was merely pretending at strength. "In that case, I'd like the contract for 300 silver." Lawrence did only so after being asked. Amati was still one step ahead of him. Once the cash and the partially fulfilled contract had been exchanged, Amati was even the first to say "very well." As he watched Amati's receding form, one ill realization flashed through Lawrence's mind. When they had signed the contract the previous day, Amati may have claimed to have insufficient cash as an excuse to provide the horses in lieu of coin. Always keeping a certain amount of cash on hand was a trait shared by all merchants. What was worse, Amati had suddenly searched out and bought pyrite just as Lawrence had. If Amati had gathered enough, all he would require was a very small increase in price. Thinking back on the way Amati had just bowed so gracefully, and turned around after accepting the contract, Lawrence could not believe that it had been a bluff. Just how much pyrite had the boy managed to buy? Lawrence feigned rubbing his nose and instead bit his thumbnail. His original plan had been to observe carefully and then begin selling off quantities of pyrite starting at noon to check the rising price. Suddenly, Lawrence wondered if he should move more quickly, but Diana's messenger had not arrived yet. Until he knew whether or not he would be able to obtain the necessary amounts, Lawrence couldn't act. He could purchase the pyrite using the gold Amati had paid him, but if Diana's negotiations on his behalf succeed, he would receive another 400 pieces worth. That would also be a problem. He'd set aside money to pay Diana with so that was not an issue, but he would have too much of the mineral. Of course, he'd been purchasing pyrite in order to be able to force the drop in its price, and he'd been careful to buy just enough to be able to control that drop in order to avoid his own bankruptcy. Admittedly, if Lawrence was willing to ruin himself in order to stop Amati for Holo's sake, she might finally accept his sincerity. Of course, the story would not end so easily. He still needed to live on something after that. The weight of reality bore down on him, heavier than the gold coins in his hand. The stone shop's price board was updated again. It seemed someone had just borrowed a large amount of pyrite. Both the price and the line numbers jumped dramatically. How much would Amati's pyrite be worth after this jump? Lawrence felt unable to simply stand by and do nothing. But losing his cool could lead to defeat. He closed his eyes, lowered a hand with the fingernails he had been biting from his mouth, and took a deep breath. Everything he had been thinking was all due to Amati's bluffing. After all, behind Amati was Holo. If Lawrence could just discern everyone's ulterior motive, he would be fine. Just then, a clear tone of a ringing bell swept overhead. It was the signal for the market to open. The battle had begun. The charged atmosphere seemed to induce everyone to stay scrupulously honest and calm. They had been waiting for some time in front of the stone cellar stand, but only began to move once the bell rang. An examination of the crown revealed travelers and farmers furtively selling small quantities of pyrite, but the small-scale selling only served to further heat the marketplace. In a situation where none were willing to sell, the only people with the advantage were those who already had large stock of pyrite. It was thanks to the small-scale selling along with new buyers that kept people excited and close to the stall's front. Since each person there thought they had a chance to profit, none left. Given such an environment, it would take a serious amount of pyrite in order to force the price down. Nothing less would do. The price board, which occasionally disappeared behind the heads of the people in the crowd, was a thermometer for the marketplace, and it was constantly rising. Diana's messenger had still not arrived. If her negotiations failed, he would have to take action quickly. The thoughts pained him as he stared at the price board, and suddenly Amati appeared in his field of vision, in front of the stall. Panic washed over Lawrence, and he wanted to dash forward, clutching the bag of what pyrite he had to his chest. But if that was Amati's plan to shake him up, such a move could be disastrous. If Lawrence sold off only a middling amount, it would just increase demand, as buyers assumed they would be able to purchase pyrite so long as they waited long enough. And as the line grew longer, the price would continue to rise. Lawrence controlled his urge to sell, praying that this was a ploy on Amati's part. Then he realized something. Holo was gone. Lawrence glanced around and saw at some point Holo had moved outside of the strange crowd of people and was looking at him. When their eyes met, she narrowed hers in displeasure, then turned and began to walk away. As he saw this, sweat sprung upon Lawrence's back. This had to be a trap that Holo was hinting at. If she had heard of the circumstances surrounding pyrite from Amati, it was entirely possible she'd contrived the way to trap Lawrence. Someone as clever as Holo would surely notice things that Amati would miss, even if he was the one explaining the situation to her. And Holo excelled at discerning what was in people's hearts. She was unparalleled at such things. As soon as he thought of this, Lawrence was assaulted by a vision of quagmire that surrounded him. No matter where he stepped, he would sink into the mud. No matter whose movements he watched, they would all be illusions. Lawrence suspected darkly that this was all part of Holo's plan. The terror of having a sly wolf circling him thus sank into his body. Yet Lawrence couldn't abandon hope that Holo was merely doing this out of some perverse obstinance. The poisons of assumption and doubt penetrated his mind. He stared blankly at the price board, though this was not his intention. It was simply all he could do at the moment. The price of pyrite continued to inch upward. Fortunately, since the price was already so preposterously inflated, the rate of which the increase was quite slow. Still, if the price continued to increase at this rate, it could certainly reach by noon the 20% needed by Amati. To Lawrence's knowledge, Amati's current stock of pyrite was worth 800 pieces. If the price rose 20%, he would need only 40 more silver pieces to reach the required 1,000. And if all he needed was 40 coins, Amati would surely be able to produce them. He could sell whatever of his fortune he needed to and complete the contract on the spot. If that happened, the margin sale poison that Lawrence counted on would undoubtedly have little effect. Where was Diana's messenger? Lawrence muttered to himself, a consuming panic sinking into his gut. Even if he was to start scrambling to buy pyrite now, how much would he be able to collect? It was not like the previous night, where the market had already been closed and no one knew whether the price would rise or fall next. No, now it was utterly obvious that the price was rising. Anybody who had pyrite knew it was like free money. Nobody would sell him under such circumstances. The realization hit him. His plan could only succeed if he got the pyrite from Diana. And at this rate, he might wind up taking a huge blow from Amati because of the margin selling contract as well. Lawrence rubbed his eye and thought hard. He had planned to pursue his goal coolly, and logically, but he was starting to feel as though he'd been forced into a complete dead end. No, he told himself. No, he told himself. He knew what the problem was. It was not because of the fluctuating price of the pyrite. Behind that was the fact that he now regarded Hollow with despair rather than trust. She had arrived with Amati at the marketplace. It was possible that rather than meeting up in the morning, she'd spent the night together. Hollow might have invited Amati back to the inn after Lawrence had arranged the margin selling contract with him. Depending on the circumstances, she might even have shown him her ears and tail and told him the truth of her existence. Lawrence wanted to believe such a thing was impossible, but he remembered that Hollow had revealed her true nature to him the same day they'd met. It was the same height of folly to believe that she had somehow marked him and only him as particularly open-minded. Amati was clearly madly in love with Hollow. No doubt she could evaluate anyone as quickly as she had Lawrence. And what if Amati had accepted her? He remembered the young merchant's smile only moments ago. Hollow feared being alone, and Lawrence was not sure that she wanted to be with him, only him. The realization that he should not be thinking this way hit him, and his legs nearly collapsed under him at the shock of it. It was out of sheer luck that he didn't fall. Suddenly, a murmur ran through the crowds, bringing Lawrence back to himself. He turned to look at the oohs that arose, only to see that the price of the most expensive pyrite had jumped significantly. Someone had put in a large bid. Its acceptance meant that the others would soon follow suit. It might already be impossible to stop Amati from fulfilling the contract. The fact that there was still no word from Diana suggested that the other party might be too stubborn. If the price of pyrite continued to rise, that would only make them more reluctant to sell. It was looking more and more as if Lawrence should abandon the hope and take action now. The weapons he had on hand were 400 silver pieces worth of pyrite, along with the rumor that land had given him to spread. That land had been given to spread. It was such a pathetic erasal that Lawrence wanted to laugh. He now seriously doubted the idea he'd had such faith in the previous day, that a mere rumor could do any damage. Only yesterday it had been his secret weapon, the product of his years of experience. It was becoming more and more clear to him just how drunk he must have been. He realized he was already trying to think a contingency plan. If he did nothing, he would still receive 1,000 silver pieces from Amati, which would leave him a tidy profit even after subtracting the losses from the margin selling. Lawrence was disgusted by how much lighter it made him feel. If you could receive 1,000 silver coin pieces from me, it would not be so regrettable to let me go. Hollow's accusation hit him. Lawrence remembered the letter from Diana was tucked near his breast. It was the information that would help him find Hollow's home of Yoitze. Perhaps he no longer had any right to hold this letter. Just a lowly merchant. Lawrence thought of himself as he looked around for Hollow. The events that happened in the port town of Pazio and the church of Ruvenhagen had been but a dream. As soon as the thought struck him, he realized that it seemed to be exactly so. Lawrence smiled weakly as he looked into the hotly swirling crowd, but Hollow was nowhere to be found, so he moved elsewhere. Some time had passed since the opening of the market, but the day's festival had not yet started, so more and more people seemed to be making their way in, Hollow remaining elusive. Cursing his inability to find her, now of all times, he realized something. After he'd met her gaze in the crowd, Hollow had walked away. Had she simply left him right then and there? If so, where had she gone? Had she decided his failure was a foregone conclusion? Lawrence wandered and returned to the inn. It would stand... Lawrence wandered and returned to the inn. It would stand to reason. The idea was so humiliating that Lawrence felt broken, just thinking it. And he believed himself. He wanted some wine. Immediately after the thought occurred to him, he uttered a small questioning sound. Huh? Sorry. He'd been scanning a fairly small area, so his eyes were bound to notice the detail eventually. Amati had entered his field of vision, which caused Lawrence to make noise of confusion and surprise. Amati's right hand was pressed up against his chest, probably holding a bag of coin and pyrite. The problem was not what he was doing, but rather the expression of concern on his face, and the way he looked here and there, searching for something, just like Lawrence. Lawrence suspected Amati of putting on some kind of act, but then by some miracle the crowd between them thinned and Amati noticed Lawrence. He was clearly surprised to see his rival. And then Lawrence glimpsed a look of relief on Amati's face. Though the crowd quickly closed in around them and blocked Lawrence's view again, there was no mistaking that he had what he had seen. A single thought jumped out at Lawrence. Amati, like him, was looking for Hollow. Not only that, Amati had been relieved to see that Hollow wasn't with Lawrence. Lawrence felt a thump, as though someone's shoulder had bumped right into him from behind him. He turned to see one mercantile-looking fellow talking excitedly with another. "That's odd," he said to himself, whereupon he felt the same thump reverberating in his back. Then he realized it was the pounding of his heart. Amati had been frantically looking for Hollow and was obviously very worried that she would be with Lawrence. The young merchant did not trust her fully, which in turn suggested there was no reason for his doubt. But what is it? It couldn't be. If Amati was looking for her, that meant she had not told him where she was going. And if that alone was enough to cause Amati stress, it was very unlikely she had revealed her ears and tail to him. It was enough to make Lawrence want to abandon the dark, dismal conclusion he'd come to only a moment ago and turn to brighter assumptions. He had no confidence in his ability to tell whether or not this was wishful thinking, however. It was vexing enough to make him nauseous. Suddenly there was another cry from the crowd. Lawrence looked hastily toward the stone cellar and saw that somewhere along the line the placard for the highest value pyrite had been removed, which meant it had sold at that price. And that wasn't even the reason for the shouts. The placards marketing the highest value for various types of pyrite had all been taken down. And there was a drop in number of plates for buyers in line. Someone had sold off a considerable amount. Lawrence fought back the nausea that rose and looked frantically, trying to spot Amati. He was not in front of the stall. He wasn't even near it. When Lawrence finally spotted him, Amati was in the crowd. He was watching the stall with a shocked expression. So it hadn't been Amati who had made a large sale. Lawrence felt but a fleeting moment of relief before more placards for waiting buyers went up, along with new round of cries from the crowd. Nearly everyone here had at least a small amount of pyrite. They were waiting for just the right moment to buy or sell. The market was starting to fluctuate, which would become another factor for them to consider. Essentially, now was the right time to sell. Lawrence was on the verge of giving up, but pushing him in the opposite direction was the thought that he could still accomplish something with his plan of carefully selling off a large amount. But he soon thought better of it. Like some kind of cowardly hare, Lawrence had no idea what Holo was thinking or where she had gone. People's hearts were not so easily understood. To think otherwise was to invite ruin. And yet, Lawrence could not help thinking. Expectation? Suspicion? Superstition? And reality were four hooks that tore Lawrence's thoughts. What would Holo the Wise Wolf say at a time like this? Pathetically, Lawrence couldn't help but wonder. He felt that he could make a decision based off even her most casual observation. He trusted her. Just then... excuse me? Lawrence felt a tug on his sleeve as the words reached his ears. He rolled and as if struck to see a certain cheeky girl behind him, but it was a boy. Land, to be precise. Mr. Lawrence, may I have a moment? Lawrence turned with such speed that Land was taken aback for a moment, but the boy's expression made it clear there was urgent business. Anxiety swept over Lawrence as he looked around, and then he knelt down to bring his face closer to the much shorter Land and nodded. A customer has come to the shop wishing to pay for wheat in pyrite. Lawrence understood immediately. Mark was willing to take the offer and then sell Lawrence that pyrite, assuming Lawrence could pay cash. How much? If Mark had sent the boy all the way over here, it had to be a sizable amount. Lawrence swallowed and waited for the reply. 250 silver, said Land. Lawrence clenched his teeth to avoid shouting the unexpected development. The wolf god of the harvest might have abandoned him, but the goddess of fortune was still on his side. Lawrence immediately pushed a small bag he'd gotten from Amati into Land's hand. Go, as fast as you can. Land nodded and then tore off like an envoy carrying a vital message. Perhaps the market continued to fluctuate, perhaps indicating that the price had topped out. The number of buyers on the line placards had changed shockingly fast. It was clear that the buyers and sellers were beginning to turn completely against one another. With the price this high, some would start to sell, while those needed the price to go still higher would buy. Occasionally, Lawrence would catch sight of Amati at the other side of the crowd. He had no doubt that Amati was watching him as well. The fact that Amati had kept such a close eye on both the stone seller's stall and Lawrence suggested that he hadn't yet raised the 1,000 coins he needed. No, that's not it, Lawrence corrected himself. He might already have raised the money, but was worried that if he sold off the pyrite he had on hand, trading might go awry and cause the price to crash before he could sell his entire stock. And because Amati was party to Lawrence's margin selling contract, a crash in price would hit him with a huge loss. There was one other important fact as well. The 500 silver pieces worth of pyrite that Amati had held still only existed in form of a paper contract. It could be bought or sold, yes, but the physical pyrite and contract presented could not be collected until that evening. If the market had started to fluctuate instead of simply rise, and the possibility of a drop was now much more real. If Amati was to sell the certificate, what would happen? Margin transactions involved an interval of time between the exchange of money and goods. In an environment where a drop in price was anticipated, a margin sale certificate, which promised future goods for immediate cash, was a joker, a worthless card with a grinning witch on it. Once the market value of the product actually dropped, whoever held this joker would be ruined. The slow-acting poison of Lawrence's margin sale was beginning to take effect. Amati was still glancing this way and that, desperate. He was obviously looking for Holo. Holo had probably guessed what Lawrence was up to and told Amati of the trap. The wind seemed to about to change. Offense and defense were reversing themselves. If Lawrence did not strike, he would be letting a once-in-a-millennium chance go by. People nearly attacked the stone seller stall at the price placards, and the price placards were swapped out one after another. Lawrence held tightly to the pirate in his breast pocket, desperately hoping land would return soon. It did not take too much time to run to Mark's stall and back. Just then, a voice echoed across the crowd. "A purchase is in!" Someone had been unable to contain their excitement. In the moment, as if the market were a wave-tossed ship. In that moment, as if the market were a wave-tossed ship that had suddenly regained its stability, the mood shifted again. Someone had purchased a large amount of pyrite. This suggested that the price would continue to rise. Buoyed by the expectation, the crowd seemed to settle down. Land had not yet returned. The more time passed, the more the market seemed to steady itself. But the number of possible buyers was dropping. Lawrence could take this opportunity to sell off a quantity of the pyrite and sweep away this stability. If he did that, he might be able to clear out the buying line, even if it was just for a brief amount of time. Doing so at this precise moment would surely have a profound effect. Lawrence made his move. He slipped between the crowds, pulling a bag of pyrite from his from his breast pocket as he arrived before the stone seller's booth. "I'm here to sell." As everybody watched, Lawrence threw the bag of pyrite down in front of the stone seller. The stone seller and his apprentices were stunned for a moment, but they quickly came to their senses and resumed business. Lawrence had tossed the stone into a quiet lake. Now came the rippling effect. The measuring was done quickly, whereupon the apprentice that held the line placards took the pyrite pieces off to the various buyers who had ordered them. Lawrence immediately received his payment. Without bothering to count, he grabbed the bag of coins tightly and looked back into the crowd. He caught a glimpse of Amati's stricken face. Lawrence felt neither vindication nor pity. His sole concern was his own goal. He had sold all the pyrite he had on hand. Any further attacks would have to wait until he had more. Where was Land? Where was Diana's messenger? If he had the 400 silver pieces worth of pyrite he was expecting from Diana, there was no question he would be able to turn the marketplace around. He was at the crossroads of destiny, and then he heard a voice. "Mr. Lawrence!" It was Land, his forehead shiny with sweat, as he ran up to Lawrence and offered him another bag. It was 250 silver pieces worth of pyrite. Lawrence was torn between returning immediately to the stone seller stall to sell the pyrite he had now on hand, or waiting for Diana's messenger to come so he could be sure. He cursed himself. Had he not now given up? Had he not even now given up on Diana? The negotiations had dragged on for so long. There was a limit to how optimistic Lawrence could be. He had to take his chances. Lawrence turned and prepared to venture forth again. There was a loud cheer that froze him in his tracks. "Oh!" The crowd blocked his view. He couldn't see what was happening, but the instant the chair arose, Lawrence's intuition almost compelled him to cry and run. It told him the worst had happened. He pushed his way back through the crowd to the place where he could see the prize board. It was admirable indeed that he didn't fall to his knees on the spot. The top prize of the board had been renewed. The man had pushed it back up. It seemed some of the market buyers had decided that the disturbance a moment ago was a temporary fluctuation, and that they had to put in a wave of purchase orders. Purchase line placards were put back on the board. Lawrence suppressed the urge to vomit. The decision of whether or not to sell the pirate he had again pressed on him. There was still some small chance of success if he took action. No, the wise decision would be to wait for Diana's messenger. The amount of pirate he was negotiating with her was worth 400 pieces of silver then. It might as well be 500 by now. If Lawrence could add that to what he already had, it would be enough for another big sell-off. As Lawrence was placing his hopes in a small chance, he saw Amati, now looking much more at ease, walk away from the stall. The young merchant was planning to sell. It was unclear whether or not he was going to sell all he had, though. Lawrence didn't have to know the boy's plan to realize that he would only exchange some fraction of his pyrite for coin. Amati had probably realized the nature of Lawrence's slow-acting poison, so he would want to unload the certificate first. Why had Diana's messenger not come? Lawrence wondered if he had been abandoned by the gods. In his mind he screamed, "Excuse me, Mr. Lawrence." In his despair, Lawrence thought he'd heard wrong. "Mr. Lawrence, I presume?" A small figure stood beside Lawrence. His face, or possibly her face, was impossible to tell as it was impossible to tell the sex of this person, hidden behind a shroud that covered all but the eyes. It clearly was not land, which meant that it was the person Lawrence had been waiting for. "I have a message from Miss Diana." The messenger's pale green eyes had a tranquility complete unlike the swirling commotion that surrounded them. There was a mysterious aura around the messenger. Lawrence couldn't help but feel this person was truly a messenger from the gods. And if so, perhaps a miracle was about to happen. "She wishes to tell you that the negotiations have failed." A moment passed. "What?" "The other party is unwilling to sell. Miss Diana apologizes for being unable to live up to your expectations," said the messenger in a clear voice, as if announcing a death. Was this how it would be then? Lawrence wondered. True despair did not come from hopelessness. No. When his last tiny speck of hope was crushed at the last moment, that was despair. Lawrence could not reply. The messenger seemed to understand this and turned around silently. Somehow the messenger's form receding into the crowd became conflated in Lawrence's mind with the memory of Hollow as she walked away from him in the tunnels of Patsil. Lawrence felt like an ancient knight in rusted armor as he looked up at the prize board again. The purchase line had returned to normal and the price continued to climb. One could write changes of the market, but only the gods could control them. Lawrence remembered the words of the famous merchant: with just a bit more luck, just a bit more, a merchant can be a god. Having exchanged some amount of his pyrite for coin, Amati strolled away from the stall and returned to the outer ring. Lawrence expected the young merchant to flash him a cocky, triumphant grin, but Amati did not so much as glance at Lawrence. There must have been someone else commanding his attention. Hollow had returned to Amati's side. Mr. Lawrence? It was Land that now spoke to Lawrence. Hollow was speaking to Amati and looked nowhere else. Oh, sorry. You've done a lot running around for me. Thanks. Oh no, not at all. Could you give Mark a message for me? Tell him my plan has failed, said Lawrence, surprised at how easy it was to say. Yet despite... Sorry. Yet despite the failure from the standpoint of the merchant, it was a very nice outcome. Lawrence still had some pyrite on hand. All he needed to do was buy a bit more to have what he needed to hand over to Amati in the evening. And then subtract the cost of that from the money he'd made selling the previous lot of pyrite. The amount left over would probably be positive. On top of that, he would probably receive 1,000 silver coins from Amati, which could not be called anything less than a huge windfall. Such profit would have been enough to make any merchant happy, but Lawrence felt only a vast emptiness. Land was momentarily at a loss as he looked about, but just as Lawrence was about to hand him over his compensation, the boy's eyes filled with steely resolve. Mr. Lawrence! Land's expression was enough to stop Lawrence's hand, which held a few silver coins. Are you giving up? Lawrence remembered his days as an apprentice. Anytime he wanted to make a comment, he had to be ready for a beating. Land was likewise prepared to be struck. His left eye twitched as he expected the fist to come at him at any moment. My master always tells me that merchants never give up. Lawrence pulled his hand away, and Land's shoulder twitched in response. But the boy did not look away. He was entirely serious. My master always says that it's not those who pray at that the god of wealth watches over. It's the stubborn ones who never give in that he blesses. Lawrence did not disagree, but what he was after was not wealth. Mr. Lawrence, Land's gaze pierced him. Lawrence glanced over at Hollow for a moment before looking back at Land. I... began Land. I liked Hollow from the first time I saw her. But my master told me, said the faithful apprentice. He wordlessly completed every task given to him, yet now Land was every inch the young boy. He said that if I said it in front of you, I'd get a sound beating. Land was on the verge of tears as Lawrence raised his hand up high. Land gasped and flinched, but with his fist, Lawrence could only tap the boy lightly on his cheek, smiling. Yes, I suppose I should give you a beating. A sound one too, he said with a chuckle, though he wanted to cry. Land seemed roughly 10 years younger than Lawrence, yet with things the way they were, he felt no different than the boy. Damn, he cursed himself. It seemed that before Hollow, any man could turn into a runny-nosed lad. Lawrence shook his head. The stubborn ones never give in, eh? It was a laughable phrase, and he sighed at its seductive charm. Looking up into the sky, at the sky, the words of the boy 10 years his junior had wiped from his mind the maelstrom of supposition and doubt. Land was right. He'd gotten this far, and the profit that remained in his hand was only proof of his true loss. He could lose it without regret. There was no reason to not think everything through one last time before taking action. Things of value did not always come with hard effort. Mark had only a short while ago made him realize that. Lawrence opened his spigot on this considerable memory, pulling out the materials he needed to construct his new approach. The pillar of his new plan was something he'd forgotten until just a moment ago. The ones who just can't give up. They're the same ones who just can't stop themselves from being so optimistic. You wouldn't believe it, said Lawrence. Land's happy expression was more than appealing than the boy's normal, overachieving nature usually tended to. There was little doubt that Mark treasured the lad as he would his own child. A merchant makes plans, predicts the outcome, and always holds the results up to the light of reality. Understand? Land nodded politely at what appeared to be an unconnected statement. If selling one item causes something to change, thus another item will cause change to change so. Such hypotheses are also important, you see. Land nodded again. Lawrence knelt down so he was close to the boy's face and spoke. But if I'm honest, these hypotheses can be anything you might like them to be. If you make too many, you'll become lost, seeing danger and risking every deal you do. To avoid that, you need some kind of a guidepost. Something to believe. It's the one thing every merchant needs. The young lad looked something like a real merchant as he nodded. I see, he said. If you can't believe in that guidepost, then no matter how absurd the idea that leads you to, Lawrence looked up and closed his eyes. You can trust it. Even so, a voice in Lawrence's head told him it was impossible, and yet he looked at Holo. When he looked at Holo, he was almost convinced. There was a small chance, that Holo's choice of dress said something. Despite the idea's outlandishness, if he was to put it to the test, it might well prove to be true. But his idea required that one condition had to be met. It was that Lawrence had forgotten earlier, namely, the possibility that Holo had in fact not abandoned him. Considering this now was just the kind of thing a stubborn, optimistic merchant who never gave up would do. At this stage of the game, it seemed far better to think as much than to continue trying to stop Amati. Battery on my headset is empty. Oh, that's better. Where was I? He had no idea what Land had heard from Mark that made the boy so willing to help. In any case, it was clear that Land told the truth when he said he liked Holo. It was impressive that he'd been able to admit that in front of Lawrence. Were their places reversed, Lawrence was not at all sure he would have been able to do the same. Before this display of courage, it was the least Lawrence could do to live up to this idea of the fearless, optimistic merchant. Lawrence patted Land on the shoulder, took a deep breath and spoke. Once I sell my stones at the stall, start spreading the rumor I asked you to. Land's face lit up. He nodded his head, once again the consummate apprentice. Good lad. Lawrence was about to turn around, but he stopped short. Land's eyes were full of questions, but Lawrence was the one who asked, "Do you believe in the gods?" The boy was surprisingly dumbstruck. Lawrence chuckled and repeated himself. "There's a good lad," he said before walking away. He had 250 silver pieces worth of pyrite on hand. Tallying up to the purchase line, markers on the board showed that there was already 400 silver pieces worth of orders waiting. Even if Lawrence sold all the pyrite he had on hand, it would have no real effect. But no, it would have an effect. If his new assumption was correct, it had to. He glanced back at Holo for just a moment. She was standing by Amati. Just 1 second would be enough. If Holo would look just 1 second in his direction for a moment, that would be enough. And then Lawrence stood in front of the stone seller's stall. The influx in orders had slowed. The shopkeeper, having finally regained a measure of calm, looked at Lawrence with a face and said, "Yes?" He then smiled an expression that seemed to add, "You're making out pretty well today." Despite no words being exchanged, Lawrence nodded. He was about to make a lot more. He thrust the bag of pyrite he'd received from Land toward the stone seller and spoke. "I'm selling." The shopkeeper received a cut from each transaction, so he smiled heartedly and nodded. But then he looked strangely stunning. Lawrence closed his eyes and smiled. He had been right. "Master, I too shall sell." The voice made Lawrence nostalgic. With a loud thud, a bag of pyrite at least twice the size of Lawrence's was slammed down on the counter. Lawrence glanced sideways, and there was Holo, looking ready to bite his head off. "You fool," she said. Lawrence's only response to her accusation was a smile and a heartfelt "Sorry." The shopkeeper stood there, amazed for a while, and then he quickly ordered his apprentice to remove the purchase line placards from the price board. The two bags came together to at least 650 silver pieces worth of pyrite. The amount Holo had was appraised before the day's bump in price, so it was probably worth even more than that. The mysterious party that had bought pyrite from Diana was, of course, Holo. Put simply, nearly 1,000 silver pieces worth of pyrite had been sold all at once. There was no room for the man to push the price up in the face of that. Lawrence plucked at one of the white feathers affixed to Holo's robe. "She's quite a grown-up beauty, unlike the certain someone I could name." Holo jabbed Lawrence's side with her fist, but then her hand remained there. That was enough, Lawrence thought. Though behind them a mob crazed and pushed and shoved, Lawrence would not take his hand. Lawrence would not take his hand from hers. He did want to show off to Amati, though. Lawrence smirked at himself for being so childish. The price crashed in an instant. There were few purchases that came in after all the existing purchase orders were filled. But the sale of close to 1,000 silver pieces worth of pyrite tipped the market in favor of selling, and the price soon dived. The ones who were the least fortunate were who held that old maid card in the end, were the ones who'd been waiting just a bit longer to sell their stock at the highest possible price. Even the sharp-eyed merchants who noticed Lawrence and Holo's action and sold as quickly as they could had taken losses. Amati's fate went without saying. He had been able to sell off a margin contract. He had been able to sell the margin contract just a moment ago. Amati had been witness to Holo dashing forward with a large bag and had reached out to stop her. And there she stood, in the same pose, frozen in shock. No doubt Holo's betrayal came as a far worse shock than the margin certificate he held now turning worthless. On that point, Lawrence had sympathy for him. Holo clearly had no intention of ever staying with him, and had in fact separated from him in a particularly cruel way. Evidently, Amati had said something to Holo that she simply could not abide. Lawrence didn't dare to ask Holo what it is in fear of the response, but he still wanted to know if only he wouldn't make the same mistake for himself. So, this contract is over then? Holo asked, not even bothering to look up as she groomed her tail. Lawrence had just returned from finishing the contract with Amati and thanking Mark for his trouble. There was still an edge in Holo's voice, not just because the two had only just finished the Battle of Wales. Lawrence, of course, knew the reason. He set things down, took a chair and replied, "It's over." "Alright. It's over, alright. As cleanly as we could ever hope." He had indeed just finalized the contract with Amati, who looked like his spirit had left his body. In the end, Amati hadn't actually lost money. Against the margin loss he'd taken because of Lawrence, Amati had made a bit more intermediary sales of pyrite. Yet Lawrence understood Amati's despair all too well. Up until not long ago, he too had felt every bit as low. In the end, Amati had been unable to meet the conditions of the contract that would have allowed him to propose marriage to Holo. And as for the margin sale of pyrite, that was complete when Lawrence handed over the bag, which was by that time essentially worthless. He'd been worried about the possibility of Amati losing his temper, so Lawrence had asked the chief of the guild house to act as a mediator. This is your punishment for trying to take another man's woman," the guildmaster had said to Amati. Whether or not Holo was in fact Lawrence's woman, at least the proud Amati had learned a lesson. As Lawrence briefly explained all this to Holo, who was sitting on the bed, stopped grooming her tail and gave Lawrence an appraising look. "Surely you do not think that this is all over and done with?" She seemed to be trying to decide just how harsh his punishment would be. Lawrence understood the mistake he had made. He stood and raised both hands in a gesture of contrition. "I'm sorry." Holo was unmoved. Do you truly know where you went wrong?" It was a pathetic way for a grown man to be scolded, but Lawrence had no choice to endure it. I know. Hollow's ears, wolf ears, prickled up. At least, I think I know. Hollow exhaled through her nose and folded her arms in expectant displeasure. Amir, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it wasn't going to suffice. Lawrence screwed his courage up and apologized as best as he could now. When I started doing this on my own after the contract with Amati, I was being utterly self-centered. Despite all the consuming panic he'd felt, not only had all his frantic efforts to stop Amati come to nothing, he had been, just as he said, completely self-centered. The point is, my biggest mistake was not trusting you. Hollow looked away, turning only a single ear towards Lawrence. I shall hear you out, she seemed to be saying. Her unpleasant attitude was, of course, frustrating, but Lawrence had to admit he didn't have any foot to stand on. He looked up at the ceiling before he continued. The feathers you attached to your hood. Those were to let me know how you bought pyrite from Diana. Hollow nodded, irritated. Yet when Amati saw this pirate at the stall, trying to bluff me, I thought it was a trap you'd set for me. What? Hollow said in a small voice. Lawrence hastily shut his mouth. He realized he'd said something he shouldn't have, but it was too late. Hollow uncrossed her legs and hung off one of the edges of the bed. And what exactly do you mean by that? She asked. Hollow's chestnut brown eyes shone dully. I thought it was a ruse to fool me into acting too soon. When I saw Amati make his move, I assumed you were completely on his side. The white feathers were the furthest thing from my mind, but the truth was just the opposite, wasn't it? And certainly it was, Hollow's eyes seemed to say. Of course, now he understood her intention. You wanted to tell me that Amati had fully enough pyrite on hand. You want to tell me that Amati had fully enough pyrite on hand and that I should be moving quickly to sell off mine, right? Lawrence had not trusted Hollow, but Hollow had trusted Lawrence. That was the crux of the matter. Hollow had made Amati take an action that Lawrence could make no sense of, and for his part, Lawrence had decided it was not just Amati trying to destroy his confidence, but that Hollow had also turned hostile and was trying to force him into a trap. The only part Lawrence had been correct about was assuming that Hollow knew what he planned to do. If Lawrence had but noticed the white feathers and made eye contact with Hollow, she would have sold her pyrite with him right there on the spot. Honestly, muttered Hollow. She gestured with her chin for Lawrence to continue. And before that, the fact that you would sign the marriage certificate with Amati, that was humiliating to, but he had to keep going. It was to make it easy for me to be angry, wasn't it? Hollow's ears twitched and she took a deep breath. It seemed likely that she was becoming increasingly angrier as the memories came back to her. She must have been waiting for Lawrence to come running to the second floor at any moment, marriage certificate in hand, and yet no matter how long she waited, he had not come. She might have waited until dawn. Lawrence counted himself lucky that she hadn't torn his throat out. Didn't I tell you in Reuvenhagen? Don't be clever and subtle all the time. Tell me what you're thinking. If we can just yell at each other, problems will get solved a lot faster. Hollow scratched the base of her ears, as though she could not possibly become any angrier. She'd purposely been unperturbed when Lawrence saw Amati walking out of the inn, and even had a marriage certificate ready, all to make Lawrence angry, all to make it easier for him to speak his mind. And Lawrence had thought she was notifying him of her intentions. And now that he had thought about it, Lawrence realized that the situation there in the inn had been a perfect one. Perfect for him to pour his heart out and admit to Hollow that he did not want her to accept Amati's proposal. If he'd only said as much, it would have been enough. So I was wrong from the start. Hollow drew in her chin and gave Lawrence a look that went past displeasure right into resentment. That was how far wrong he'd gone. When you'd lost control because of the business of Yoitsu. That last apology you gave me, that was... I am sorry, she had said that night with her hoarse voice. That was because you had come to your senses, wasn't it? Hollow glared at Lawrence. She glared and her fangs showed. After her onslaught of verbal abuse filled with ill intent and distortions, Hollow had realized how awful she was being, and yet she had not continued to be stubborn. She had apologized immediately with all sincerity, but Lawrence had only made things worse by taking her apology as a final word that sealed away her heart. If he'd managed to say something then, Lawrence thought he might have been able to salvage the situation. Hollow must have been stunned. She had truly apologized for the terrible things she had said after losing her temper. But instead of accepting the apology, Lawrence had backed out of the room and run. She was no fool. Hollow must have seen that Lawrence misunderstood her. Yet, having realized this, Hollow thought that chasing Lawrence down just to explain how he was mistaken would have been ridiculous. She must have assumed he would realize his mistake sooner. Her eyes were now full of anger at Lawrence's failure to see this. You fool! She shouted, standing up from the bed. They say a fool's errand is worse than a sloth. It is even so. Not only did you render useless my efforts, but you thought I was your enemy? And then for some reason you would go and pursue that contract with the boy. Do you have any notion how difficult that made things for me? We may have only met recently, you and I, but I'm of the feeling that we can share an uncommon bond. Am I deluding myself, or do you really... I wish to continue traveling with you. There were only a few steps between the desk and the bed. Human and wolf, merchant and non-merchant, separated by only a few steps. If Lawrence had just reached his end out, it would soon reach her. My life has been naught but business from dawn to dusk, but I plan to keep it that way. Just think of me as a little slow when it comes to anything besides business. Hollow's expression turned sulky. And yet I do wish to travel with you. Well, what am I to you? It was the question he'd been unable to answer. Now, however, he was completely certain. It cannot be explained in words. Hollow's eyes widened, her ears prickled up, and then she laughed, so frustrated with Lawrence she was fit to cry. What sort of dried up old statement is that? Ah, but I thought dried turkey was your favorite. Holo chuckled with her fangs very, bare mouth very near Lawrence's hand. I hate it. Lawrence felt a pain shoot through his palm, but quietly accepted this as punishment. Though I do have one question for you, said Lawrence finally. Oh? Said Holo. She looked up after biting Lawrence's hand with a considerable anger. How did you know there was pirate in the alchemist's quarter? Wait, no. Amati probably told you. What I want to know is how did you get Diana to sell it to you? I just can't see it. Holo looked out the window as if to say, "Oh, that." Dusk had arrived, and the second evening's festivities were about to begin. It seemed that the giant puppets from the first night were being used, though they were much worse for wear. Half of the large lupine shapes had lost their heads. The participants' fatigue was obvious, even from the distance, as they tottered along. Some even fell on their bottoms, and not in jest. Yet the column marched on, pulled forward by the sound of flutes and drums. Hollow looked back to Lawrence. Her eyes beckoned him to join her at the window. Having no reason to refuse, he did so. The boy Amati told me everything he knew, so I was able to make a fair guess at what you were planning. But your plan was, well, I should compliment you. Hollow looked out on the festival as she leaned back into Lawrence. He was unable to see her expression, but having been complimented, he felt he should accept it gracefully as he could manage. Yes, so, Diana, was it? I went to see her for a different reason. Truthfully, a different reason? I suppose you location from the scent of the leather. The place stank like the worst hot springs. It was far from enjoyable. While Lawrence was impressed at Hollow's keen smell, he had to admit the alchemist's quarter must have been quite an ordeal for her. Hollow sighed softly and continued not looking at Lawrence. So I asked her thus. I asked her if she would not invent a story of Yoitsu still existing, and if she would pass it on to you. Lawrence cocked his head for a moment, confused, but then he understood. Had he heard such a tale from Diana, he would surely have found it easier to speak to Hollow again. But that as a trigger, he would have needed nothing more. However, continued Hollow, her tone suddenly irritated. That girl had me explain all the circumstances to her for her only to turn me down. Oh, really? Lawrence thought back on the words Diana had spoken to him as he left her house. Good luck to you. Had it been sarcasm? It was your fault that I was refused. Consider that, why don't you? Lawrence was jolted from his reverie by Hollow stomping on his foot, though he did not follow her meaning. Honestly, I suffer through the humiliation of explaining everything, and I am on the very cusp of success, and then you show up and make that girl come up with her pointless plan. He was stunned beyond words. Hollow had been there when he'd visited Diana. She said it would be good to test your resolve. The gal acting as if she knows me. Lawrence now understood whence came Diana's good luck to you. He felt like he was forgetting something important. I also heard that foolish question you put out to her. Lawrence shouted, his voice strangled. Hollow grinned devilishly and turned around to face Lawrence. So there are many stories of gods and humans becoming mates, eh? Her upward cast eyes were frightening. She slid her slender arms around Lawrence like a snake entrapping its prey. If that's how you feel, I would not mind, though I'd ask. The light that fell through the window cast a red glow on Hollow's features. I'd ask you to be gentle with me. She must really be a demon, Lawrence thought to himself half seriously, but she soon dropped her act. I just cannot seem to arouse myself after talking to that girl, said Hollow, looking tired as she gazed out the window, her arms still around Lawrence. She seemed to be looking not at the festival, but somewhere far away. Did you notice that she was not human? Hollow finally said. Lawrence couldn't even manage a surely not. You saw the feathers scattered around about her room, yes? Those were hers. They were. Although now that Hollow mentioned it, Lawrence recalled that something about Diana had made him think of a bird. Hollow nodded and continued. Her true form is a bird, much larger than you. She fell in love with a traveling monk and spent many years building a church with him. But eventually he noticed that no matter how many years passed, the girl never aged. Thus the monk grew suspicious. No doubt you can guess the rest. Lawrence felt Hollow's arms tighten around him. He thought he now understood the reason why Diana collected stories and why she protected the alchemist so. But it would be painful to say. Surely Hollow did not want to hear it either. Lawrence said nothing. Instead, he simply put his arm around Hollow's shoulder. I wish to return to my homeland, even if it's no longer there. Oh, we will. Outside the window, the giant human lupine puppets collided, and a great cheer arose. But Lawrence realized the display was not reenacting some battle. The people were controlling these battered puppets were all laughing, and each onlooker seemed to have a cup of ale in hand. They were not hitting each other, but they were putting their arms about one another's shoulder. Soon they began to sing and dance, and the giant puppets in the center of the intersection were set ablaze. Hollow giggled. Humans are so showy. They surely are. Despite their distance from the intersection, Lawrence could feel the heat of the flames on his cheeks. The ring of revelers that surrounded the fire gave a great cheer. The bonfire itself seemed intense enough to overpower the pale moon. Once again, in the town of Kummersund, various gods and humans from near and far had come together to drink and celebrate after putting an end to their quarrel. The conflicts were finally over. Shall we go? I suppose we shall. But Hollow did not immediately move. She looked up at the puzzled Lawrence. For my part, I would not mind telling you being as passionate as those flames. For my part, I would not mind you being as passionate as those flames. The flaming puppets had begun collapsing into a single pile. Lawrence laughed. I suppose if I were drunk enough. Hollow laughed, her sharp fangs flashing. Her tail wagged as she spoke. Delighted. If you become drunk, who's to watch over me? Who's to watch over me, fool? Ah, thank you, book. 1 page. Lawrence took the Laughing Hollow's hand and led her out of the room. The Cumberson night had once again been set ablaze with festivities. Some time thereafter, it was spoken of in rumors that a true goddess had walked amid the crowds. And that is the end of this book. A good end, although I must say I saw it coming since there are like 24 more books left, so it would be very, very interesting if it were to end at book 3. But I suppose you never know what's about to happen. I do like it wasn't some miracle that he won. He just simply lost, but oh well. Yes, but that is going to be it for tonight. A shorter stream today, but it's not always bad. Let's see. Tomorrow is going to be more visual novel. Then Thursday, probably the end of Yakuza 2? Yakuza Kiwami 2? Who knows? Anyway, that is going to be Thursday, and Friday, some good old Phasmophobia. There's been a bunch of updates, so looking forward to it. Anywho, outside of that, I want to thank you all for watching, for joining me this evening, and I wish you all a very pleasant night. So sleep well, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.